So now let's try something different, okay? Let's say I wanted to make a new list. I'll call it CID2. And I wanted that new list to have all the elements that are in CID, okay? So now just to show that the new list is different, we would add medical tech to the end of the list, okay? And so CID2 in theory should have more elements than CID1 or just CID because we've appended one extra element to this called medical tech. So if I was to print CID1 and CID2, in the best case scenario, I should have one that has more elements. But as you can see here, we have exactly the same thing, okay? And both CID and CID2 have medical tech added to the end of the list. And the reason why this is occurring, I'll go into much more detail a lot later. It has to do with referencing memory locations. And if you remember, with our typical variables, if we assign, let's say, x equals 1, and then we did y equals x, x and y would be two totally different variables. But here, if we did CID2 equals CID1, we're not creating a new variable. We're just basically saying whatever CID1 is going to be, whenever we update CID1, it will affect CID2, and whenever we update CID2, it will affect CID1. I'll go into much more detail about this later, but if you wanted to copy a list, the proper way to copy a list would be to use the .copy method. So now, if I was to run my code, as you can see, CID1 or CID2 is a copy of CID1 with an extra data included. It is no longer referencing the exact same thing that CID1 is referencing. So now there's one more method that we can use here, which is the count method, okay? And as you may have already guessed, this would count how many times this specific string is seen in the list. And if you remember, we added medical tech to a list that already had medical tech in there. So we should have 2 of this here. So now let me run this code. And as you can see, the output of count medical tech is 2, since we have 2 of this in the list. So now let's talk about how to remove items from a list. So as you can see, we have 2 instances of medical tech in our list, and this is unnecessary. So we're just going to remove the very last element of the list. So if I say pop right here, what it does is removes the very last item that was added to the list. So if I was to run this code, as you can see, medical tech has been removed from the end of the list. Now, let's say, for instance, I wanted to remove an element that is not at the end of the list, but somewhere else in the list, okay? To do that, all I have to do is provide some type of parameter or input here. So for instance, let's say 2. So whatever is at index 2 is what I'll be removing instead of the last element. So if I was to run this pop method, we should remove whatever is at index 2. And if you remember, we inserted nurse assistant at index 2. So now if I was to run this code, we should see that nurse assistant is no longer in there. And as you can see, nurse assistant has been removed. Now suppose we want to remove an item, but we don't necessarily know exactly which index that item is at, but we know the name of the item, okay? So in that case, let's say we know that we want to remove registered nurse from the list, but we don't know which index that falls in. We can just simply put remove, use the remove method, and then put registered nurse as the input. And this will remove the very first occurrence of registered nurse in the list. So if I was to run this code, as you can see, registered nurse no longer exists in my list. And finally, if I wanted to remove everything in the list, I can simply use the clear method. So if I was to run my code now, as you can see, everything between those brackets has been removed. And now I have an empty list. So now let's try a new list, okay? Here we have a list of numbers, and we're assigning that to a variable called myList. And we're going to try a different method, which is the sort method. And this method is supposed to sort the items in our list from smallest to biggest, okay? So in this case, if I was to run this code now, as you can see, instead of 1, 2, 5, 3, we have 1, 2, 3, 5, which is the sorted order. So likewise, we can also do a reverse on this, okay? So this is similar to what we did with string slicing, where we basically showed the very last item first and then counted backwards from the very last item. So in this case, if I was to run this code, as you can see, we're listing the items in the list from the last to the first. So now suppose we want to find items in the list. You want to see if an item exists in the list. So I'm trying to determine if one is in my list. So the command looks something like this. If I run my code, I can see that it is true, which means one exists in my list. But if I put something like this, which is 10, I get false because the number 10 does not exist in this list. You can also use some other math operations on this list. So for instance, we can say, get me the minimum number in this list. So if I run this code, the number that is the minimum is 1. And if I do max, I'll get the largest number or the maximum number. And as you can see here, the largest number is 5. We can also do sum right here. So we will just basically add all the numbers in our list together, and we will get the sum of these numbers. So depending on what you plan on doing with your coding, this could be very useful, or you may not even ever use this. But it's good to know that it's available to you if you ever needed it.